Welcome, friends, comrades, and attendees of today's CPI conference. I'm Sam.
And I'm Gian, and we're here to welcome you to Toward the End of Empire, the 2020 Elections and the 21st Century, presented by the Center for Political Innovation. You just heard from Max, the sax, performing the March of the United Front.
We're the hosts of a podcast and online magazine called Twink Revolution, and we'll be here as your hosts to introduce today's speakers and cultural performances and to keep everything moving along smoothly. Remember to participate in the chat, and we'll be taking questions at the very end.
So we'll be getting into our speakers and presentation shortly, but first I wanted to say a little bit about the Center for Political Innovation and about today's conference. So the CPI is a new think tank dedicated to driving forward the state of our analysis. It's not a political party. Rather, it's here to sharpen our analysis and give us better tools with which to engage with the world with the hope of improving it. You'll be hearing from several people today who are involved with the CPI and from CPI's chief executive, Caleb Maupin. You can also find out all about CPI's work, including book publishing, online events like this, and when a pandemic allows it, hopefully some upcoming in-person events and conferences. And you can see more about that at cpi-usa.org. So today's conference is called Toward the End of Empire, the 2020 Elections and the 21st Century. And through every period of our history, it's been easy to sort of stand back and say, wow, this feels new and it's different. So, by even commenting this, I'm inviting my own future derision. But the continuing fracturing of the existing order does feel unique. And with the victory of Biden and Harris, we're bound to see the return of a kind of friendlier, gentler, more humane face of American imperialism. And as in every other era of sort of kind smiles and smart bombs, we're faced with a choice. Do we retreat into our comfortable activist circles and keep shouting the same slogans for each other's benefit? Or do we carefully analyze the conditions and direct our actions accordingly? And, there are plenty of people who can tell us what won't work, right? Or who can catalog the utter horrors faced by working people of this country and around the world. But if we're ever going to change anything, we need to understand where we are now and where we're going. And, even within, say, the resurgent socialist left in America, there's no shortage of enthusiasm. We have people. But despite the surprising number of people who list their occupation as, say, activist or organizer, it's still not clear, what are we activating and who are we organizing? So we're in a position that's unique. Unlike in the days of old when we had good ideas, but nobody to follow them, our challenge now is actually a lack of good ideas sometimes, I think. And so there's no lack of energy and enthusiasm, but we need the analysis, we need the consideration. Otherwise, that energy just will dissipate and be co-opted back into the same imperial structures we've seen over and over again. So the American left under a Biden and Harris administration must not become yet another form of controlled opposition. And that's going to take new ideas, new tactics, and a community of people willing to fight for workers everywhere together. And that's why we're delighted to be here supporting the CPI and presenting today's speakers.
Okay. To start us off, we have the local branch president of the Black Hog College chapter of Students and Youth for a New America, Gavin Locker, to give us an activist report.
Well, thanks so much for the host of the Twink Revolution for spinning the wheels of steel for this momentous occasion. And I just wanted to say a couple words about what SINA has been doing locally here in Western Illinois and nationally as well. So nationally, we have a brand new Discord, which you can find right down there in the description. And we also have a weekly meeting on an app called Marco Polo. It's a study group essentially, and we talk and shoot the breeze. It's a lot of fun to do. I would highly recommend it to anyone and everyone, especially if you're a student of any kind, be it high school, college, university. And locally, there has been we have been making calls to lift the ban on rent control in Illinois, as well as the local DSA has been involved in that as well. And we've shown some films and things of that nature, but it's no secret that this pandemic time has really been a kick in teeth for any and all organizers, regardless of political orientation. And so I would really just advise everybody to not get discouraged, because this too shall pass. And let me just say that that it's if anyone is interested in forming a Students and Youth for New America, assign a club at their college, that just talk to me or jump on the Discord. It's a fairly easy process. All it requires is a little bit of follow through. And when it comes down to this, we have to remember that even though this is a really discouraging time, we are not victims. People have different situations. You may be a victim in a situation or a crime, but you are not a victim overall. And we have the power to change our own material conditions. And this is something that the left, if you want to call it that, has really slipped on in many decades. And I really feel that it's a profound problem. This self-pity that many socialists, communists, and self-styled revolutionaries would think of themselves. And we need to understand that the cliche would be you are your own worst critic, but I think that that's true. But at the end of the day, you have the power to change your situation. And when it comes to starting a club, don't get discouraged, because especially at a community college like where I am, people go in and out. Some people will inevitably lose interest. People graduate and are leaving for many different reasons. There could be problems. You're inevitably going to get at least one person who is there to basically spy on the group. Don't start any witch hunts. Just be cool. Don't advocate anything illegal. In terms of, I'm really encouraged to see what Max has done at his local high school in Northern Virginia, setting up a SINA there. And I'm really excited to see this movement keep going forward. And here in Davenport, there's a local controversy with the Civil Rights Commission that we have been following and recording as well. And so there are many different things I guess I could talk about, but I just wanted to say a few words that we're in this to win this. And it's I just wanted to tell everybody to stay the course, and don't be afraid to keep going with this. It's a long uphill battle. The algorithms on the social media sites are very rigged against any kind of anti-imperialist. But if you can bring these ideas to colleges and high schools that really challenge the imperialist narrative, you can change the conversation. The difference with CPI, the Center for Political Innovation, is that we don't just want to highlight one side of the conversation. We want to actually change the conversation, go beyond the imperialist and American exceptionalist mindset, so that we can get toward a more sane, just, and peaceful world. Thank you.
Thank you, Gavin. Next up, we're going to hear from another musical performance, or cultural performance, sorry. We're hearing from Paul Shepard, who's a musician from the DMV area. We'll play for time while Paul's getting set up. There is going to be a Q&A later, so if you have questions, remember you can put those in the chat, and all our speakers today will be available to answer your questions towards the end of the proceedings.
All right, thank you, guys. My name is Paul Cranker. I'm a jolly banker. I'm a jolly banker am I. For a couple of dollars, I'd sell out my own mother, singing, I'm a jolly banker am I. When cash you are needing and mouths you're feeding, I'm a jolly banker am I. For a couple of pennies, I'd smother the infant. I'm a jolly banker am I. people are sighing and crying and dying. I'm a jolly banker am I. The most hideous leech has got nothing on me, 'cause I'm a jolly banker am I. My name is Paul Cranker, and I'm a jolly banker. I'm a jolly banker am I. Just give me back 2 for the one I lent you, 'cause I'm a jolly banker am I. You'll hear from the boss, you'll hear from the banker. If you go to your mother, will you tell her that we thank her? She worked all her life and wore down her health to raise us a wage slave, much like herself. But when we're free, you will see it's the future belongs to the worker. Hear from the liars in the corridors of power how lucky you are to toil hour after hour. How lucky you are to be breaking your back, so leeches on Wall Street can stay in the black.
Oh, I think we lost Paul.
Oh, no.
We might have a reprise at some point, but so thank you, Paul. He probably can't hear us because I think he fell off the internet.
Oh, no.
This is the challenges of slick online conferences. You know, people.
The COVID reality.
Well, let's move on to what's next.
Up next, we have everyone's favorite anti-imperialist trucker and the creator of the YouTube channel, Dust James, Anti-Imperialist America. Dust James, to give us some remarks and testimonial. Welcome.
Hello, friends. I'm Dust James of Anti-Imperialist America. Not feeling the best right now. I'm just getting off of my 6th in a row, 12 to 13-hour shift. Switching over to day cab, and I'm exhausted, but I'm absolutely honored to be here with great folks doing great work. And that's just how it is. I appreciate everyone being on time and being respectful. This is sacred to me to come out of a little bit of time I have with my family, and the one day off, the night after I get off of work, to be with folks and build socialism and put into work, innovate ideas, give people ideas on how to talk to their neighbors and co-workers and build workers' power. And this is the life of a communist. This is what we need. This is out of the movement to the masses. The masses of the people are not all students. They're not all middle class intellectuals. It is the working people, the people of the oppressed nations, the ones who are disenfranchised by this system, that will be pushed through the worsening conditions and the fall of empire to make the changes we need in our society for the better, brighter future of socialism. I guess this is post-election. I went in I did a few post-election coverages, both on my show. At this point, I'm doing 3 lives a week. At least I'm trying to. I have my video blog, Dust James, Anti-Imperialist America. It's happening usually Sunday morning. I'm also doing a international worker and class revolt television show with the comrade from Australia, David Fox. David Fox is thinking about starting a CPI Australia. Exciting stuff. I believe we have a great interaction. You can catch me there. If folks want to subscribe to my channel, Dust James. I'm also doing an interview on Sundays. Last week I interviewed Jose Villarreal, who's an inspiring Chicano nationalist that was radicalized in prison, in the cage, within the prison of nations. within the belly of the beast. This week, I'm interviewing a comrade from Taiwan, immigrant from Taiwan, who wrote a wonderful article called "In Anti-Imperialism: The Highest Stage of Struggle," which I 100% agree with that slogan, and that's why I named my show "Anti-Imperialist America." It's the people. I recently coined the phrase, I believe I coined it, probably not, the popular front against imperialism. And what I mean by the popular front of imperialism is the main enemy today, the main danger currently is not fascism. Regardless of those caught up in the movement, in movementism, who associate anything that sounds socially conservative or anything that goes against their small, isolated, liberal bubble, that has to be rallied against. They have to be 100 times more aggressive than what they show on CNN. That is not socialism. That is not the way forward. Caleb Maupin's videos are very inspiring to me. I believe the one he did recently about showing how the West is not the best. The U.S. is not, the U.S. and Europe is not the sole owner of human rights. Past civilizations were not somehow evil. Everything that exists in the rights are all dependent on the structure, all dependent on the political economic system, all dependent on stability. And this current system, imperialism, I believe is one of the most destructive, exploitative system that has ever existed in human history. Large portions of the human population live on next to nothing. Thousands of children die every day. The U.S. is bombing 7+ different countries. There's massive genocide in Yemen as we speak, and the people are standing up against it heroically, fighting for themselves and the country and a better future. And if you listen to NPR and you listen to MSNBC or even Democracy Now, you will not find any of this. And it is our duty as communists, as revolutionaries, to seek out the truth and spread the truth and build the organizations necessary to change the world in which we live. Quick recap on the election. I believe the elections are simply a tool, a propaganda tool that is used against the working class. They focus on social issues like gender, identity politics. These are important issues, but they focus on issues that are divisive, that will divide the working class. And what they never do, they might have Bernie Sanders say we might get health care or push for health care, but he never gets in the power. He drops out of the race when there was still a chance. And then he tells people to back leaders, half of the leadership of this disgusting terrorist organization we call our own government, tells us to back them, sheepdogging imperialist. Today, I was working, I deliver up in Norfolk, and I had the parking lot I was supposed to go into was full. And I was like, what's going on? It looked kind of like a fair. There was balloons everywhere. And there was this truck and a bunch of boxes, lines of cars, hundreds and hundreds of cars, if not 1,000 cars. And I looked at the sign, it said turkey giveaway from the Salvation Army. And this is a military town. And this was at a mall that is falling apart, that is falling to pieces. People are hungry and food lines. These are our people. And we must do what is necessary and form the ideology. Just as one of my ancestors did in the Second Great Awakening, that gave the part of the social revolutionary force to bring about the Second American Revolution, the Civil War, and end slavery. We must end imperialism. That is all. All power to the people.
Thank you, Dust James. Well, we are moving along swiftly through today's proceedings, and we've reached our keynote address. So this is the main event. This is what you're here for, and then we'll be swiftly into a question and answer segment for your questions right after that. But so this keynote is by Justin Simons, a researcher for the Center for Political Innovation, and it's called "Multilateralism and the United States in the 21st Century: How Foreign Policy Developments Have Shaped the Changing Nature of World Affairs."
Hello, can you hear me? Excellent.
We can.
Fantastic. Hello, everyone. My name is Justin Simons. I'm a researcher for the Center for Political Innovation. And today, the Center for Political Innovation presents Multilateralism and the United States in the 21st Century: How Foreign Policy Developments Have Shaped the Changing Nature of World Affairs. Before I begin, I'd like to thank the Center for Political Innovation for allowing me the opportunity to be here and speak to you all today. I also want to have a special thank you to Caleb Maupin for encouraging me to make a presentation for this. It's been a huge honor to be here. I look forward to continue to contribute to the CPI and what we can do in our Youth Wing SINA to ensure that we change hearts and minds and really build something of extraordinary value here in this country. So right along, content and context. So there's really 4 objectives we're here to discuss here. First off, defining terms and ideas regarding multilateralism, illustrating the historical material importance of multilateralism as a global system of inclusion, developing the requisite concepts for people and institutions to actuate models gearing toward a multilateral outlook, and finally, to illuminate the importance of multilateralism as a new road toward peace, prosperity, and cooperation. This presentation is divided into, I think, about 4 parts. The first part is really discussing the terms and requisite ideas. The second part is discussing the history of international relations as a whole. The third part is discussing the United States and empire. And finally, the fourth part is the discussion on what to do about it. So moving right along, what is multilateralism? Multilateralism nominally is the coordinated diplomatic interaction between 3 or more states. That is the general facet of development, right? That's the top-down viewpoint of what multilateralism is as a concept. Qualitatively speaking, though, that's where it gets its. Sorry, there's a little feedback. I apologize. Qualitatively, these are the aspects that manage persistence, right? When we talk about the definitions, qualitative assertions are what inform our definitions. So qualitatively, it's just persistent and connected sets of rules, formal and informal, that prescribe behavioral roles, constrain activity, and shape expectations. In other words, it's not simply about a relationship, but rather the structure of that relationship, right? Any nation can have a relationship with another nation, but the key factor here is the structure in which that relationship takes place. Is it a mutually beneficial relationship? Does that relationship promote ideas and equality? You know, these are factors of international diplomacy that are starting to change the facets of how we engage in the global system. And that's something that we really need to discuss here. So what is the importance of multilateralism? Well, it provides a voice for developing nations to have a say in international affairs. It allows for applied features of international law and economic inclusion to provide and maintain peace and prosperity on the basis of mutual development. It allows for commonality and equitable representation in terms of policy practice on the world stage, often through the utilization of intergovernmental organizations, such as the United Nations. And finally, and this is the key tenet here, this is the really important part, undermining the central tenets of hegemony and imperialism as a matter of coercive potency. So when you have a relationship built on the idea of mutual inclusion, right? Relationships built on mutual benefit, where we're all included as equal partners, that undermines, in a general sense, the aspects of imperialism and domination that we've seen over the course of history, right? When you have a relationship built where we are equal partners, this engages a new aspect of discussion. And I think that's a factor that we have to talk about when we engage in multilateralism in a global scale, right? When we talk about China and Russia, they're not seeking, it's not about seeking domination, it's about engaging nations as equal partners, not simply being subservient. So there are some other terms that we have to engage with. First and foremost is bilateralism, right? The conduct of political, economic, or cultural relations between two sovereign states. This is the most common form of international relation. It simply means one state working with another state. But these other two terms are the ones we really want to focus on here. First off is hard power, the use of military and economic means to influence the behavior or interests of other political bodies, i.e. the power through coercion. And then there's soft power, the use of social, cultural, institutional, and economic means to influence and develop relations with other political bodies, i.e. power through credibility. Now, if you were to look at hard power in the dictionary, and you had a picture next to that definition, the picture you would probably find is a picture of a U.S. carrier strike group. The United States is essentially the poster child for hard power diplomacy throughout the world. It uses its martial power quite exclusively. It manifests itself in other ways to ensure that our interests are met. But the key component here is that what gives America its power, right? You know, when Roosevelt talks about speaking softly but carrying a big stick, we really fundamentally take that to heart as a country. And the unfortunate reality is that that's a manifestation that is outdated. I think it's archaic, but more importantly, it's simply unsustainable. Now, if you were to look at definition of soft power in the dictionary, right? When you engage soft power, power through credibility, if you saw a picture next to that definition, you'd probably see the picture that we have posted here. This is a picture of the port of Shanghai in the People's Republic of China. It's one of the busiest container ports in the world. You probably find some other pictures, right? The International Court of Justice of The Hague, pictures of the European Union. But the key facet here is that you're not building power through force of arms, right? You're not enforcing that order through force of arms. You are enabling a relationship to flourish and enforcing the power that you're enforcing your power through credibility. You have a credible force in the world. You have the economic means to engage people without having to threaten them. And that's a key differential, right? When we enter the 21st century, as we move towards industrial parity, this is something that we're going to see a lot more of. Other terms we should probably talk about: unilateralism, doctrinal approach in international relations in which states singularly act without regard to the interests of other states or without their support. The United States is pretty much guilty of this. We typically engage in foreign affairs without regards to their neighbors or how we think other countries will view us. And countries who are probably scared of the United States probably don't want to make a scene and backlash, right? They don't want to outlash against what we're doing. So unilateralism is a key facet of U.S. foreign policy. It has been for decades, and it will probably continue for quite a while. Other definitions, of course: hegemony, dominance of one group over another, often supported by legitimating norms and ideas. Hegemony is not simply the idea of domination. It is about creating norms to enforce that domination. When you engage in hegemonic behavior or hegemonic systems of oppression, it's not simply the act of domination. It's about legitimating that act. It's about legitimating that domination. So that's hegemony. Imperialism. When we talk about imperialism, the Marxian view has quite an extensive definition of imperialism. I have chosen the simplest one I could find. The policy, practice, or advocacy of extending the power and dominion of a nation, either by direct territorial acquisitions or by gaining indirect control over the political and even economic life of other territories. So that's a pretty basic definition. It's the one we're going to be using today as we move forward to the presentation. So first, onto our next section here, the brief historical perspective on international relations. This is kind of sort of inform our idea of what multilateralism is, what it means, what it has meant in the past, and what it could mean in the future. So between 1450 and 1945 was the period of Western hegemony. Following the crisis of the 14th century, Europe began a socio-political and economic transformation that would alter the course of human history. New technologies would foster people to travel greater distances over a shorter period of time, increasing communications and trade throughout the world. With the end of feudalism in Europe came the development of private property, the formation of the nation state, and the economic doctrine of mercantilism, the predecessor to capitalism, and with it, the establishment of trade posts throughout the world. This in turn, however, would also lay the foundations for one of the most disruptive periods in human history, the era of Western hegemony, dominated by European empires set on the exploitation of people and resources and the capturing of new markets. So when we talk about the crisis of the 14th century, we're really talking about the crisis of feudalism. And when we engage in this idea, there's a difference in the means of production, right? Marx talks about the means of production. In feudalism, a lot of that is tied to land, tied to your fief as a feudal lord, tied to your fief as a peasant. With the crisis of the 14th century, you have a mass die-off, mass transformation. European civilization basically collapses and then rebuilds itself. But with it also comes a new idea in the modes of production, and that is the idea of free land and labor. And that creates the context of mercantilism, which is going to evolve later into capitalism with the Industrial Revolution. And with mercantilism, the issue then is no longer an issue of controlling land, right? That's not the key facet mode of development. What is the key facet mode of development is the control of markets. And that's going to really change the way all global economics really functions up until now. So then there's the height of Western hegemony. With the advent of the Industrial Revolution, capitalism replaced mercantilism as the premier economic system of global trade and commerce. By the end of the 19th century, the West would come to dominate much of the planet. European colonies and outposts existed on every habitable continent, and a majority of the world's population would become subject to the Western powers. For those territories not directly under Western control, they were usually subjugated through a brutal regime of unequal treaties and military interventions in order to procure the West's desired strategic, economic, and political interests. Competition between the Western powers was fierce, and the possibility of globe-spanning conflicts became the modern reality, even prior to industrialization, as early as the 16th century. And here we have illustrated a map of the world as it was at the beginning of the 20th century, the previous century, in 1914. Each color represents an imperialist power in the world. As you can see, much of the world is in color. And normally you think, oh, that's a good thing, but really it's not. It really shows how much of the planet was dominated by capitalist forces, dominated through exploitation, through force of arms. And it was a very coercive and disruptive period in human history, because cultures, civilizations, aspects of human knowledge were simply lost or destroyed during this period of time. And Europe and the West in general gained great benefits from it. They exploited and murdered for the sake of profit. And that's one of the most tragic periods in human history. And as we continue this discussion, we're going to see more and more of how that's going to play out. So competition between imperialist powers in the First World War. I'm not going to go too deep into it, but long story short, it comes to a head in 1914. So in World War I, you have a number of European powers, and they're all engaged in this general struggle for supremacy over the world. But there's a difference, right? When we look at global conflicts prior to World War I, say like the Napoleonic Wars, or say the 7 Years' War, right, of the 1750s, these were not capitalist wars. They were not industrialized wars, right? The 7 Years' War was a mercantile war. They're not using machines and mechanizations to engage in combat. It really was a much more scaled down aspect of economic development. And in the Napoleonic Wars, capitalism did exist, but industrialization had not fully formed throughout Europe. In fact, most of the nations involved in the Napoleonic conflicts, they were not capitalist or industrial powers at all. So World War I really would be the first capitalist industrialized war. And industrialized warfare, if I'm being quite honest, is one of the scariest forms, right? Because you now have machines that can do double duty, that can murder on a mass scale. And this requires resources and great technical development. And these resources to fight these wars they were taken from European colonies on the backs of what is considered virtually slave labor to manifest this massive conflict. A war not between the working class or the capitalist class, but a war between imperial kings and presidents and people of the bourgeoisie, right? This is a war that's unlike any other we've seen in history. And it was one of the deadliest up until that point. Between 10 and 15 million people died in Europe throughout the world as a result of the First World War. But in the aftermath, we have new ideas, new nations, and the League of Nations. And this is going to change the concept of international relations as a whole. So when we engage with the League of Nations, we see something incredibly new, right? We're changing the idea of what human rights mean. We're changing the idea of what it means to live in an industrial world. So the end of the First World War saw the end of the old order of Europe, as well as the carnage and bloodshed of modern industrialized warfare on a global scale. This in turn necessitated the need for a new system of international relations, one that would help preserve world peace and prevent the possibility of such a conflict arising in the future. The Treaty of Versailles and the subsequent meetings of the great powers would come to establish the first worldwide intergovernmental organization, with the goal of establishing a community of nations and preserving world peace and prosperity. The League of Nations, founded in 1920, would be what had been hoped the foundation for a new system of international diplomacy and arbitration. Now, there is one massive problem with this. The League of Nations was founded and enforced by imperialist powers. And you could imagine how that would actually lead to. So when we talk about the League of Nations, we also talk about the failure of the League of Nations. Now, there's a myriad of reasons why the League failed. I have posted 4 here to kind of illuminate. So first and foremost, it was built upon the foundations of imperialism. The interests of imperialist countries often superseded the interests of human rights and peaceful arbitration. The League of Nations did not recognize the full equality of human rights for all people. That's a huge one. Recognition would interfere with racist ethnic policies in place at the time by European powers and in subject states as a means of socio-political domination. It was also selective in terms of membership and policy. It was biased against countries opposed to imperialism and biased against economic competitors to Britain and France. And finally, it lacked the institutional means for international enforcement of the League of Nations decisions and policies. That's also a pretty big one, but we'll discuss that later. With the League of Nations, it's essentially the organization founded by Britain and France to legitimize its imperial holdings after the end of World War I. And although it was coined as an organization for peace and prosperity, it was really an organization to preserve the New World Order that the Entente had won after the defeat of the Central Powers. And it would be more believable if the Central Powers were also able to become members of that organization. Many of them were not allowed to become members of that organization. Some nations decided not to join, like the United States, who vowed that this organization was simply a phase of European power. And of course, some organizations were not allowed to join, like the Soviet Union. They were not allowed to join. They ended up joining it for a very brief period of time between 1934 and 1939. But as Britain and France sort of saw the Soviet Union as a competitor in Europe, they eventually were kicked out. So that's a huge facet of development. But then, of course, we have the rise of fascism in the Second World War. With the Great Depression beginning in 1929, this would usher in the general collapse of liberal democratic governments and liberal capitalist institutions around the world. The result of this collapse would advance and the march toward the development of violent, ultranationalist political movements with the establishment of fascism as the ideological contender on the global scale. Opposed to both liberalism and socialism, fascism in a general sense constructs the global outlook as a struggle between the clash of civilizations and then necessitates the mobilization of a state's productive resources as an extension of civilization for their preservation in this perceived struggle. The global fascist movement, in particular, fascist states with irredentist and imperialist interests, such as Italy, Germany, and Japan, saw the established global order, in particular the derisory attempts at the community of nations, quote unquote, under the Anglo-French purview via the League of Nations, would be deriding and interfering with their apparent nature of their own national struggles. So with the desperation of economic collapse of capitalism come the rise of corporatists, really bulldog defenders of capitalism, right? We have the fascist movement, but fascism in and of itself is its own ideology. I'm not going to get into that because that's a whole conversation for another time. But essentially, this comes to challenge the order that's currently in place. The rise of fascism and the Second World War, with several invasions and annexations that took place during the interwar period conducted by fascist states, despite international condemnation, the powerlessness and perceived illegitimacy of international institutions like the League of Nations were unable to contain and prevent these acts of aggression. The Anti-Communism Pact of 1936, the Pact of Steel, quote unquote, in 1939, and the Tripartite Pact of 1940 would solidify the establishment of, quote unquote, the Axis alliance, opposed to liberalism and international socialism. Full-scale war would break out between the European powers again in 1939, with Germany's invasion of Poland. Japan, having been involved in a full-scale war in China since 1937, would also join the General War in 1941. So, with the failure of the League of Nations comes the Second World War, the system of peace that had been brokered after the war, which really wasn't a system that was long-term and sustainable. And in any case, that clearly collapsed, and it had faltered for a number of reasons, but mainly because of the crisis of capitalism, but also because it was juxtaposed to what it actually intended to do. Right? They talk about world peace and human rights, when really it's enforcing the policies and commitments of the British and French empires. So, in World War II, we have the Allied powers and multilateral cooperation. So both the Soviet Union and the United States would join the Second World War in 1941, having been attacked by Germany and Japan, respectively. The Allied forces of the US, the USSR, China, Britain, etc., in addition to over a dozen other nations and governments in exile, including France and Poland, established the basis of a formal multilateral military alliance, known simply as the United Nations. The United Nations would establish a working and strategic structure across ideological and economic lines, establishing what could be argued as the first modern multilateral political institution. The Allies, as they were referred to informally, would fill certain strategic niches in order to facilitate an efficient end to the war. One example of this was the Lend-Lease Act, under the purview of the United States. Though established prior to the formal U.S. entry into the war, the effects of U.S. industry providing war materials to allies would prove to be invaluable. Just to give an example, 17,501,000 tons of military equipment and supplies were shipped from the United States of America to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics between June 22nd, 1941 and September 20th, 1945, over the duration of Lend-Lease. This is really one of the first times in history, by the way, we see nations working across ideological lines to achieve a common goal, the goal of defeating global fascism, as it is a threat to both liberalism and international socialism, and also due to the primary and material fact that their nations were in fact in danger. And we see cooperation on a grand scale for the first time across these ideological lines, across these lines of what we may perceive to be impassable. We see this cooperation taking place, a relationship which ultimately fostered an end to the war, and the relationship the Axis did not have the ability to sustain. So then we have the United Nations, the plan forward. So what is to be done? Well, the United Nations would lay the foundations of what would become the post-war world. It was recognized that the new diplomatic structures would be necessary in order to prevent the escalation of new global conflicts, and that standards and their enforcement would be required in order to facilitate this new peace and prevent the rise of fascist aggression again. I have this lovely poster, by the way, it's my favorite poster, of the United Nations Fight for Freedom, and it has every nation of the Allied nations on it. It's just quite something to look at. So the end of the Second World War and the recognition of human rights, the Second World War was the bloodiest conflict in human history, with roughly over 70 million dead, which really is an incalculable number when you put it into today's terms. The horrors of the Holocaust, the atomic bombings, and numerous acts of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and other heinous acts of indiscriminate violence, which shocked the human race to its core. The concept of human rights as a universal principle had only existed as a moral convenience up until this point in history. It would be to the scourge of the Second World War that these principles, this concept of human rights, would be codified and enforced as a material universality in both principle and in practice. And that is a game changer. That changes the entire facet of global international relations. It changes the entire facet of national relationships, and it really changes the course of human history as we know it. And then we have the United Nations. Toward the end of 1945, the United Nations transitioned from being a formal military alliance into a new intergovernmental organization with the intent of preserving world peace. The UN would replace the flawed and ineffective League of Nations. The Charter of the United Nations and the Statute of International Court of Justice was signed and ratified by the founding nations in 1945. The founding nations being, of course, the Big Four and about a dozen other countries. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UDHR, was also established and ratified by the United Nations General Assembly in 1948. This is really the first time in human history where we see an actual codification of human rights as a document, as something that can be referenced to, as something that can be emboldened and empowered upon. The decisions by the United Nations would be enforced through multilateral systems and structures, including the establishment of the United Nations Security Council, the UNSC. The general purpose behind the United Nations Security Council was a means of enforcing UN policy. The League of Nations clearly didn't have that ability, especially since it really was a bunch of imperialist powers competing against each other, and enforcing UN policy would mean, creating war. But with the world powers all on the same page, on the same council, this would be very different. However, as history would show, that didn't necessarily play out in ways we like it. And that will be explained more in the U.S. hegemony side. But here is the silver lining. The end of European colonialism and the twilight of Western hegemony. With the destruction of Europe and the proliferation of new ideas and industrial infrastructures throughout the world came the twilight of Western hegemony. Though humanity had paid a high price for the war, the value of human liberty had finally been realized. Though many European powers would seek to maintain control over their imperial holdings, the material logic and the rationale for maintaining vast colonial empires would also soon be lost. New modes of human development would begin to take root. Though within a new era of independence and national liberation would also come a new phase in hegemonic application. With the European empires out of the way, the void was being filled by a new hegemonic superpower, the United States of America. These pictures, by the way, I chose these two deliberately. On the top is the independence of India in 1947. And on the bottom is these are French foreign legionaries being escorted away from the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, which was won by the Viet Minh National Liberation Forces in Vietnam. And then we have the post-war United States and the rise and fall of American hegemony. Again, we have new images. This is a very famous photo from the Great Depression, but I still think it holds out. The family driving in a car says, "There is no way like the American way." And on the top is actually an airbase in Busan with F-86 Sabres, one of the first military actions the United States conducted after World War II. So we have the United States of America and the quote-unquote New World Order. So at the end of the Second World War, the United States of America would singularly come to possess roughly 52% of the world's wealth in 1945. I just want you to stop and think about that number for a second. Over half of the wealth on the planet Earth was owned by one country, and that was the United States of America. To emphasize how crazy this is, 39% of the industrial capacity on all planet Earth at the end of 1945 was also owned by the United States at the end of World War II. So really, the United States, even though it contributed a lot of material to the war, it didn't contribute a lot in lives, it certainly came out quite on top. With the industrialized nations of Europe having been devastated by the war, it seemed as though international capitalism was once again in danger of collapse, as the international marketplace had been ruined in the conflict's aftermath. The United States of America sought to rebuild the shattered global market by investing in both the reconstruction of Europe and Japan, both as a means of preserving international capitalism and as a bulwark against communism, its competitor. The Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 would seek to establish the basis for a new international system and structure for global capitalist trade and commerce under the purview of the United States. This would seek to regulate the operation of monetary and trade policy throughout the world and would lead to the establishment of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank. The European Recovery Program, the ERP, otherwise known as the Marshall Plan, would seek to physically aid in the reconstruction of industry and infrastructure to facilitate the return of these devastated nations to global capitalism. So you can imagine in a war where 70 million people died, 50 million of which died in Europe, which was the heart of global capitalism at the time, it basically ruined capitalism. It destroyed it, literally, like in the literal sense of that term, destroyed it. And that is a pretty serious problem because you really can't have capitalism without global markets. And so the United States realized this, understanding that there has to be some sort of plan to rebuild global capitalism after the war. And so they got together with the Western allies, the non-communist allies of the alliance, and they basically said, look, we have to get together. We have to create a new thing because we're not going to be able to rebuild the global system without some support and coercion. So they ended up having the Bretton Woods Conference. They ended up establishing new rules and regulations. And a lot of this would be led and enforced by the United States. Then, of course, there's the early Cold War and ideological lateralism. So to maintain this new strategic and economic order, a formal military alliance was established known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, founded in 1949, consisting of mostly liberal democratic and capitalist countries. The alliance was designed to operate as a focal point for industrial standardization and strategic cohesion against the forces of quote-unquote communist aggression. Of course, there is a mythos involved in what would become known as the free world as they came into being during this period. The basic conception behind the free world was that what united the nations of Europe and North America are the common interests and values and principles which foster the fundamental elements of quote-unquote Western civilization, i.e. capitalism, liberalism, and individualism, etc. There's this mythos of the free world. This kind of informs the idea of what they're fighting for is just and really logical. And this is sort of used as a play really throughout the 20th century, and even today, people believe in this concept of the free world and the unfree world. And this is used to great propagandic effect. And then, of course, there's U.S. hegemony and containment. Now, with the United States possessing the largest expeditionary forces on the planet, a strategy of containment had been developed as a means of A, preventing the spread of communism internationally by supporting anti-communist governments and providing martial support when necessary, directing newly independent nations into the U.S.-dominated economic order, undermining socialist and anti-imperialist political movements via co-option, usurpation, or dismantlement, and, of course, investing in the strategic infrastructure in order to maintain and proliferate this new global system. So I'm going to spend some time a little bit on containment here. The concept of containment really comes out of the post-war falling out between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. So this multilateral alliance had been formed during the war, which really was, for a lot of people in America, really an alliance of convenience. For the Soviet Union, alliance for the benefit of the world. This ended up breaking down, of course, and what ended up happening was, essentially the leading to the Cold War. And with this came this idea of, oh my God, the Soviets have taken over half of Eastern Europe, and they're going to do all these things. And America came up with this plan, not a smart plan, but a plan to contain global international communism, despite the fact that most of the nations in the world that would come to embrace socialism as a concept are nations fighting for national liberation, which were under the control of their allies in Europe, which made it a little more complicated because it wasn't simply about containing the Soviet Union. It was also about containing socialist national liberation movements as well. And this requires a great deal of material threshold, right? It requires a lot of guns, a lot of tanks, a lot of money, and also a lot of political capital and people, something that the United States had but also didn't have. And this is something that was illustrated in a number of their conflicts. Two of the notable ones I can discuss here is the Korean War between 1950 and 1953, a war which, by the way, has not technically ended. And, of course, the disastrous, really spectacular failure of the United States during the Vietnam War, a war in which the United States supported the military junta of South Vietnam over the socialist North Vietnam, backed by the Viet Minh, the former Viet Minh, who are now supporting the who are now called the Viet Cong, or the National Liberation Front of Vietnam, engaged in a struggle for national liberation. The United States would ultimately lose the Vietnam War, which would ultimately change their strategy of containment, and at a significant cost of political capital as well as material capital. So then there's the late Cold War and the abandonment of ideological lateralism. So first and foremost, the failures of containment led to a recalculation of U.S. strategic principles. They figured their approach should be multifaceted in terms of ideological and diplomatic components, geared toward realistic goals of attainment based on requisite material threshold. And finally, they should seek long-term goals through complexity of viewpoint and action. So in simplistic terms, when we talk about the failures of containment as a strategy, it was simply too great a task for the United States to maintain over a long period of time. It requires the U.S. maintaining that material threshold, while the people they're fighting against are also gaining material threshold. I think that's something that wasn't really taken into consideration from the beginning. But also, there's a degree of support that has to be maintained, right, among the population of the United States for conflicts, like, say, the one in Vietnam, which they did not have. And there was a political crisis, a very real, dangerous political crisis for the American ruling class in the 1960s, which led to the immediate abandonment of this plan and this strategy, and really a refocusing of what the U.S. foreign policy would mean going forward into the late Cold War period. And what this means, of course, is rapprochement, right? It means re-engagement with the left in the world, because it's not simply about socialism and ideology, but it's also about the material threats to the Soviet Union. And you have the U.S. going to China. Nixon goes to China in 1971. You have the United States engaging with organizations like UNITA in Angola, run by cannibal Joseph Samiti, right? There is a massive influx of change. We have the United States backing Pol Pot in Cambodia. These people who call themselves communists, Pol Pot and Savimbi, they're engaged in these struggles, but they're engaged in struggles against the Soviet Union, against the broader term of communist league. So when we talk about the U.S. re-engaging in the strategy, it has to be multifaceted. It also has to be realistic in terms of its goals. It has to incorporate the fact that liberalism is not the only ideology in the world. They have to somehow kind of engage and break away these elements of the global socialist movement in order to manifest their own power. And this would come to bite a lot of these countries in the butt. But more importantly, it would come to help embolden and undermine the international socialist movement as a whole. So then we have the issue of unilateralism. So after the Vietnam War and the conflicts in Asia and Africa that the U.S. has been supporting, the traditional allies of the United States were becoming disillusioned with the idea of an ideologically based struggle between, quote unquote, the free world and communism. The U.S. itself had undergone a period of popular discontent in the political and strategic blunders of the early 60s and 70s, which I just talked about, though a return to ideological moralistic application began to resurface by the end of the 70s into the early 1980s. So we have people like Ronald Reagan and and people like Jimmy Carter discussing, America being a symbol of hope and peace and prosperity, whatever, and engaging this concept of the free world still. We're going again to this idea of we represent these values. But Reagan took it a step further, right? Reagan engaged the American public in a way a lot of people couldn't. And it got people believing that our struggle was not simply a struggle of material empires, right? Material conditions. It's also a struggle of a moralistic one, right? We represent freedom and democracy and life and liberty and human happiness. And that got people fired up. And there was a rebuilding, a restructuring of the U.S. military during the 1980s. And what we have is the second push. And the second push would be promoted by more unilateral actions being conducted on the part of the United States to recapture the strategic momentum from the post-war period, and to engage the communist bloc and anti-imperialist countries by applying overwhelming force and unwavering resolve. So America would act more alone in the future. It would act on its own. This way, it's not expending political capital along with its allies. America would conduct unilateral actions, because it had the material threshold to do that, right? It didn't require all these countries to be involved at the same time. So the United States did conduct these operations. And in Grenada in 1983, and in Panama in 1989, the United States unilaterally engaged those countries, invaded these places, and killed. And we have images here from the invasion of Grenada. There's a sign here that says "Communism stops here." This is really the mentality of U.S. imperialism, right? They're trying to reignite this moralistic struggle. And then we have the unipolar world. So with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 came a period of unipolar ascendancy unlike anything had been seen in human history. While short-sighted headlines exclaimed the end of history, the gradual rolling back of material gains and sovereignty made in parts of the world once free from U.S. hegemony were quickly subsumed by the new global neoliberal economic regime being perpetuated by institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. U.S. strategic power reached its zenith in this period, with military installations in almost 80 countries, including much of the former Warsaw Pact. Unilateral action on the part of the United States became a conditioned normality in international relations, even defying many objections and condemnations by the United Nations, the very organization that sought to preserve world peace and prosperity. During this period of time, we see the U.S. engage in unilateral actions throughout the world and engage in bringing countries who are subservient to this neoliberal regime into conflicts throughout the world, namely, of course, in Iraq and Afghanistan. We see the U.S. acting and engaging in these conflicts with little heed to the international community, to what organizations like the UN say, because America can do it, right? And when America invaded Iraq in 2003, the UN condemned it wholeheartedly. They were vehemently opposed to the invasion. But despite that, America did it anyways, right? And their allies went along with it. And that's because of this hegemonic system, right? With the Soviet Union out of the way, there are no more competitors. It simply was the United States. And this was a period for about 20 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, where the US really was the sole global superpower on Earth. But of course, there's also the cost of empire. And there's a lot to be said about this. And we can make a whole presentation on the cost of empire. I'm highlighting just 5 points here. So the lack of responsiveness from institutions of democratic inclusion, perpetuated by capital interests who seek to profit over people. Institutions allowing the capitalist interests to a commanding share in the political mechanizations, including domestic and foreign policy. The cost of maintenance and operation of strategic assets take priority over basic societal needs and aspirations, including healthcare, housing, education, and quality of life. This enables capital interests to subvert principles of authority to conduct themselves as they see fit, even against the will of the general public. And finally, this undermines the power of the hardworking majority in engaging these systems and structures of political action and inclusion. In other words, with the U.S. hegemonic system, we as the working class, we as the hardworking majority, we lack access to the systems of power, because those interests of power, those systems of power are controlled by the interests of capital. And they are not beholden to us. They are only beholden to the interests of capital. And so really with the U.S. empire, the American empire, comes, the end of democracy, really, right? When we talk about any facet of development that we had where we can engage in our system in a meaningful way, was really taken away from us in the post-war world. And this really changes the dynamic of U.S. politics. It changes the dynamics of U.S. foreign policy, and it drastically affects the lives of people living throughout America and throughout the world. And that last part's important because we're not alone in the world, right? The United States does not exist in a vacuum. It exists as part of the world, but we like to think, a lot of our leaders like to think it doesn't. But then, of course, there's the silver lining, right? The road forward toward the end of empire. Excuse me. We have the developed world. As it turns out, there is no such thing as the end of history. History lives and is moving forward. While it is true that the unipolar world under the U.S. hegemony existed, that level of analytical development is only surface deep. Although the neoliberal economic system has been a tremendous burden on the developing world, many nations continue to persevere and provide for themselves economic modes of development that promote sovereignty and prosperity. Many nations in the post-war era have begun to industrialize and engage in global commerce, And while there was a disparity at first, over time, these nations began to produce and even compete in the universal marketplace of goods, services, and ideas. And the picture here we have posted here is a picture of Shenzhen in southern China, the People's Republic of China. Half a century ago, it was just another city in the world. Today, it's one of the centers of global industrial output, and it's one of the wealthiest cities on the planet. And that's in the course of only half a century. We also have dynamic changes for global development. As the developing world transitions into the developed world, new modes of economic growth are open for opportunity. Nations like the People's Republic of China have developed alternative modes of economic development, incorporating multilateralism as a core tenet. With Europe firmly recovered from the destruction of the Second World War, their dependence on the United States, including the adherence to its hegemonic policies, become less of a priority and frankly less attractive in the long term, allowing them to seek singular and sovereign modes of foreign policy outside of the US system. Then there's the reemergence of the Russian Federation as a world power, and the reemergence of new great powers throughout the globe that present a challenge toward the unipolar world, instead promoting expansion towards a global realignment for a community of nations, a new, genuine community of nations. And while all this is going on, there's the decline of US hegemony and the need for change. One can make the argument in favor of sociopolitical and economic entropy. In the case of the United States, structures of control and systems of dominance, especially on a global level, must all eventually come to an end. The cost and pressures involved in maintaining a vast global strategic network and the continuous martial interventions necessary to perpetuate its existence is a substantial burden in both terms of life and material. With the world returning to a state of parity, it has become even harder to maintain the level of control necessary to continue the systemic order as had been established by the US after World War II. So as the world is returning, right, we see new nations forming, we see new nations joining the developed world. America has to compete again as part of the world community, not simply as a dictator of world affairs. And that changes the whole dynamic of the 21st century as we engage in this struggle as a nation. This requires new solutions for global issues. On the one hand, it requires the recognition of sovereign states to pursue modes of economic development outside the neoliberal system of economic change. Outside the neoliberal systemic regime. So an example of this being Venezuela and Cuba and Bolivia, right? Nations who have been oppressed by the neoliberal economic regime in a lot of ways, right? Bolivia and Venezuela in particular. We see coups, we see political movements being supported by the CIA. You know, these nations have a right. They have a right as sovereign nations to pursue their own economic independence and pursue economic postures and policies that promote their own sovereignty. Yet the United States has viewed them as a threat in their own hemisphere, and they have attacked them for it. This cannot continue as we pursue ideas of multilateralism, and as we understand it, we have to promote the fact that this cannot continue. We have to see the returning of strategic assets to allied nations, including the withdrawal of U.S. combat forces from the European continent, and the negotiated delineation of arms reduction and strategic thresholds with countries in opposition to the unipolar establishment. In other words, this concept of NATO, right? This idea of European defense for the free world, we have to renegotiate that. That is not sustainable. That is not something that is getting us any benefit. It's not giving the people of Europe any benefit. We have to engage in this conversation in a realistic term. And we have to come to terms with the fact that the world has changed. The Russians are not our enemy, right? They're not our enemy. We have to engage in this in real terms. We have to build something new and create something better that will no longer be detrimental to the human race with the threat of nuclear war, the threat of conflict. We have the ability to create a dynamic relationship. There's also the general drawdown and planned withdrawal of U.S. strategic assets in the Asia-Pacific region and the Middle East, including the renegotiation or termination of unnecessary security treaties. The United States currently, right now, is engaged in operations preserving the hegemonic system in East Asia. They have bases in South Korea and in Japan, and they have security treaties with these countries. But they also have another aspect to keep staying there, right? They talk about the DPRK. They talk about China as a threat. And the U.S. supporting interests and expanding its interest in Asia does not promote the value of world peace or security. It only threatens it. And so we have to take a stand in ensuring that we engage these policies actively and engage these things in a manner which we can get the American public to support a new point of view, one where cooperation is the facet of human development, not one of antagonism. We have to be participating in the establishment set toward new and multilateral aspects of financial and economic inclusion. Recently, there's the Asian Development Bank in China, an organization which many European nations had joined, but the United States distinctly did not. We have to engage in these new multilateral systems and institutions of inclusion. We have to engage in the fact that we are no longer our own entity, but we are part of the world. And finally, developing a cooperative and mutually beneficial relationship with other industrialized nations to pursue the common prosperity and scientific benefit for all humanity. Could you imagine a world where the Cold War didn't happen? Where the United States, instead of fighting the Soviet Union, instead of engaging in supporting colonial forces against the forces of national liberation, all that material, all that human life that was spent could have been done good for us, right? They could have actually used all that to manifest something greater. You know, even with all that, America sent astronauts to the moon, but imagine what we could have accomplished if that wasn't the case. If we worked with these countries, if we helped build a new independent world, that would have been something, wouldn't it? We could have this thing called the peace dividend. You know, in the end of the Cold War, there are people talking about the peace dividend. And that's something that hasn't really been discussed a lot, but I would like to discuss it here for a moment. The idea that now the Cold War is over, all the resources we used fighting the Soviet Union and keeping troops in Europe, all that stuff will be downgraded. It would have been put away. We could use that money and these resources to promote human development in the United States and throughout the world. But that never happened, right? The United States filled the gap, decided that control was more important than human life. And that is the future of which we live in right now. We are living in the squandered hopes of a new world. But there is hope toward the end of empire, the end of U.S. hegemony, and by extension, the final death knell of Western hegemony at large will not be brought down in a cataclysmic event, but rather will be and has been gradually and pervasively withered away as the world moves towards strategic parity and industrial equilibrium. Multilateralism will lead this charge as the new face of diplomatic and economic relationships take their course. With this will come the rationalization of economic and socio-political relationships, both domestically and overseas. This rationalization will also lead to the measured reduction of strategic assets and the level and frequency of martial power utilized on the part of the United States. In short, we are moving toward the end of empire. For many, it will be a sign of the promising times to come. But there are many hurdles involved in this process, and the future is not always decided by the nature of history. There will be a requirement on the part of those who wish to engage in building a new world. It is those who have a theory and those who strive for action who will change the course of human events. In conclusion, thank you so much for joining us today at this wonderful presentation for the Center for Political Innovation. It has been an honor and a privilege to speak to you all today. We will continue to publish new works over the course of the coming year, and new events will be posted on our social media sites and our website. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Justin. That was fantastic. Next up, we have some words from CPI's Chief Executive, Caleb Malpin.
All righty. Well, wow. I've just heard some amazing presentations. It was really, really great to hear Dust talk about, everything going on and give an inspiring speech about the need for a popular front against imperialism, to describe the giveaway of the free turkeys and how so many working class people are suffering in this time. Justin just gave a dynamic presentation about the history of international relations. I learned a lot from it. I'm sure many of our viewers learned quite a bit. Gavin gave very inspiring words about Students and Youth for a New America and the efforts to build Students and Youth for a New America as kind of a campus-based activist group that would be putting forward a constructive socialist message. We had great music from Max and from Paul. So this was a very, very great meeting. And, you know, hundreds of people are watching now, and, you know, hundreds more, probably thousands, will watch afterwards. So I'm glad we did this. This is only our second web conference for the Center for Political Innovation. So I hope that we continue to do great work like we're doing tonight. This is really, really great. And so I want to give a shout out to supporters and activists with the Center for Political Innovation in Louisiana, where they've begun doing on-the-ground activities. I know they're watching now, and some of them are actually feeling a little bit ill, but they are on the ground and doing work in Louisiana. I want to give a shout out to people in California. I want to thank Gian and Sam on their Twink Rev work and their chairing of this great meeting. I think we're all doing really, really well. And I'm just going to quickly react to some of what we've heard tonight. One thing I thought was interesting to point out in light of what we discussed is that Mark Zuckerberg, who is the CEO of Facebook, his hero is Caesar Augustus. And he has said repeatedly in interviews and profiles with magazines that Caesar Augustus is his hero. Now, the reason that he gives that Caesar Augustus is his hero is because he says that Caesar Augustus created Pax Romana, which was, you know, a situation where the Roman Empire was so powerful that there were no wars because Rome dominated the world so effectively that there were no rivals to Roman power, and there was absolute peace because Rome had absolute power. And I think that that's deeply, deeply disturbing. You know, we all want peace and we want cooperation between countries, but Pax Romana is certainly not something that we desire. That's not the kind of peace that progressive people want to achieve. But that gives you kind of an insight into how some of the Silicon Valley fascists are thinking. And I've been doing a lot of talk about these elites coming out of Silicon Valley, about the Eastern establishment and the ultra-rich wing of American capital and how they see things. And my recent book on Kamala Harris has been very popular and been very widely read, I think, because there is not enough discussion about this section of the ruling class. People like to call them globalists or you know, the higher levels of capital. There's not enough discussion about them in left-wing circles. But that also is worth pointing out. You know, I don't know if people saw Rudy Giuliani's you know, speech where he, you know, highlighted the Trump administration's allegations of fraud in the recent elections, and you know, blamed it all on a communist conspiracy that Venezuela and China and George Soros, they're all evil Reds and they're all involved in a conspiracy. But really, you know, this points to the fact that among the majority of the rich and powerful in the United States, you know, there is still a feeling that communism is their enemy. And there is still very much a longing for the you know, the economic setup of the 1950s. And, you know, post World War II in the United States, you had a military industrial complex that was established. And you had, you know, a very much a situation where the economy of the USA was being stimulated by war. But you also had a what you can call the aristocracy of labor. Lenin, in his book Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, talks about the aristocracy of labor. And that, you know, imperialism, in order to effectively dominate the world, imperialist countries develop a strata of working class people at home who have a high enough standard of living that they don't identify with the rest of the working class internationally or even within their own country. They are loyal to empire because they get a higher standard of living. And that what made the 1950s United States, the McCarthyist witch hunts, the imperialist wars, and what made, you know, U.S. domination of the world in the 1950s so effective was that aristocracy of labor. And what is really the defining aspect of the period we're living in is the fact that the aristocracy of labor is being demolished. That layer of high-paid industrial workers who worked in the steel mills and worked in the auto plants and got paid very, very high wages, and thus were very conservative and very loyal to empire because of that. That's being demolished. They don't need them anymore because of the computer revolution. They don't need them anymore because of a globalized apparatus of production where they can produce, products in many different countries. They just don't need a wealthy, comfortable labor aristocracy in the United States. And that is causing a restructuring of the U.S. economy, where, the ultra rich are saying, why do we need to have this military industrial complex at home? Why do we need to prioritize the manufacturers who are tied in with the military industrial complex? Shouldn't we kind of restructure American capitalism to be part of a global economic order rather than focusing on this domestic layer? And I think that the uprising that we saw against the Obama administration and against their policies that leaned closer to Silicon Valley and kind of what we saw with Donald Trump was that lower layer of capital that had really prospered during that setup, realizing that capitalism is moving away from the setup of the 1950s and kind of revolting against it. One can interpret the way that there was just kind of an upsurge against Jimmy Carter by the military-industrial complex in 1980, as a similar situation. But now, at this point, there is no real economic basis for continuing the 1950s military-industrial complex setup of the United States. There's no economic basis for continuing to develop an aristocracy of labor. And so we're seeing the 1950s military-industrial complex setup of the United States being transitioned out. And as a result, living standards are dropping around the country. As a result, layers of the capitalist class that really prospered because of that are being pushed out. And Silicon Valley and Wall Street are dominating and moving in a global direction. And that is the conflict within our ruling class right now. And that's why it's particularly disturbing that in the socialist movement, there's so much interest in this book called Settlers by Jay Sakai. Anywhere you go, in the Marxist movement, people are going to be reading Settlers. And the thing is, the point of the book Settlers is to say that, so many of the white workers in the United States are labor aristocrats. So there's no point in talking about socialism. There's no point in trying to build solidarity. There's no point in trying to move towards socialism in the United States because of the problem of labor aristocracy. Well, the book is about 20 or 30 years behind, because what's happening right now is the labor aristocracy is being demolished. And that means the potential for solidarity among the working class as this stratification breaks down and the comfortable layer of well-paid industrial workers who had reactionary views is being demolished. That lays the basis for solidarity like there never was before. Already among sections of the working class that never talked about police brutality or talked about suspicion of the government and police state apparatus. Now there is a widespread understanding that the government is out of control, that our rights are being taken away, that the police are out of control, that the government is listening to our phones, and we're seeing the potential for solidarity greater than ever. The opioid epidemic has caused a number of people in the white working class that maybe during the rise of the war on drugs had a lock 'em up, tough on crime attitude, suddenly realize that the war on drugs has destroyed families, and suddenly start to understand that people who have a drug problem need to be met with compassion and getting treatment, not harsh punishment, and that there is a bigger potential now for solidarity among the working class, not just domestically but internationally, than there has ever been. So the folks pushing Settlers right now are they're saying the opposite of what is needed to be said right now. Right now, we need to be building a united front or a popular front against imperialism, like Dust James talked about, not trying to further stratify or reinforce these divisions. And I think that is one of the hurdles that we have to overcome. Really, we need to understand, and as I've been working on a book on the nature of the synthetic left, I touch on it in the Kamala Harris book, I touch on it in my book City Builders and Vandals in Our Age, that the late Cold War, and Justin talked about the late Cold War and how the late Cold War was kind of a shift in the tactics of the imperialists. During the late Cold War, there was a restructuring of leftist and socialist and Marxist thought. Marxist thought suddenly became an ideology that was about creating chaos. right? There was a book published by Abby Hoffman, who was a well-known radical in the 60s, called Revolution for the Hell of It. And you look at the color revolutions that overthrew socialism across the Eastern Bloc and how they were supported by the Marxist movement on the grounds that, the Soviet Union was Stalinist or something like that. You look at what the United States was able to foment in Libya and Syria during the Arab Spring, and that leftist aesthetics have been co-opted, and leftism itself has become synonymous with a desire for chaos. And that is a big problem because the desire for chaos, many of us who are young, we're angry at authority, we're angry at society, we might want chaos. And certainly many elements within the middle class revolutionary intelligentsia want chaos. But the working people of the world, as their living standards go down, as their lives become less and less stable, they don't want chaos, they want order. And historically, if you look at the strength of the Communist Party in the United States, they did not offer chaos, they offered order. The 1932 presidential campaign of William Z. Foster for president, the slogan was, "For a revolutionary way out of the crisis." Not how to build a bigger crisis, but for a revolutionary way out of the crisis. That the communists, that the establishment of socialism in the United States would bring order to the country. People would be able to eat. People would not have insecurity in their neighborhoods. We would move toward a country where the working people were in charge, and we raised living standards, and we had a society where people were not afraid any longer. In 1940, the Communist Party ran a presidential campaign, and they had a similar slogan, but they watered it down. They made it a little more simple. The 1940 presidential campaign of the Communist Party was called "The Way Out." The Way Out. And the message of socialism at this point needs to be not that we're going to create instability, not that we're going to create chaos, but rather that we're going to create order. We are going to help working people. We are going to establish a country where people don't have to be afraid any longer. I want to contrast some of the pessimistic politics that have overtaken socialist and leftist circles with what I think we need at this time. I have long raised the slogan, we need a government of action that will fight for working families as the slogan that we can raise. We need a state that is strong enough that it will stand up to big, powerful interests, and it will stand up to big banks and big corporations and fight to protect working families. A government of action that will get things done, swift action to resolve the crisis, to meet the needs of the people. Well, unfortunately, the prevailing attitude that you get among a lot of young people that are interested in socialism is not, we need a government of action to fight for working families. It's rather, fuck this shit, give me free stuff. And I don't totally disagree with fuck this shit, give me free stuff, right? I mean, corporations get free stuff all the time. People should get free healthcare. People should get a free education. People should be taken care of. But fuck this shit, give me free stuff is a pessimistic message. It's a cynical message. It's a disappointed message. But we need a government of action that fights for working families is an optimistic message. It's the belief that we can move beyond and we can get to something better. And that's the kind of message that we need to bring. It's interesting that, Mark Zuckerberg, one of the Silicon Valley fascists, his hero is Caesar Augustus. But I think you can really contrast Caesar Augustus and his vision of Pax Romana and world domination at the point of a spear. You can contrast that with his father, Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar is the topic of a book written by Michael Parenti, The Assassination of Julius Caesar, The People's History of Ancient Rome. It's actually a very, very good book that's won a lot of awards, in which Michael Parenti, the Marxist-Leninist and scientific socialist writer, talks about how Julius Caesar, despite the fact that he was a member of the Roman ruling class, that he was a Bonapartist, and he entered a strategic alliance with the proletariat to stand up to the powerful senators and landowners, and that he actually had a vision of completely restructuring the Roman Empire. He wanted to give citizenship to peoples all throughout the cities of the empire. He spent money from the Roman budget to build up Alexandria and build up Athens and build up cities throughout the Roman Empire and make them centers of trade. And he wanted to restructure the Roman Empire so that it would no longer be a situation where Rome was gaining at the expense of the world, but rather he wanted Rome to operate and interact with countries and city-states around Europe and around the Middle East and the Mediterranean and around Africa, North Africa, on the basis of win-win cooperation. And so I tell people that basically, if you look at what Julius Caesar was doing, he was kind of envisioning and trying his hardest to put into practice a 30 years BC version of the One Belt, One Road initiative, right? He was trying to transform the Roman Empire from being a hegemonic entity that was based on winning at the expense of people around the world, and restructuring the Roman Empire to be an alternative form of globalization, where Rome got richer as countries throughout Europe and throughout North Africa got richer as well. And that was the vision, right, of changing international relations to make it sustainable. That empires are not sustainable in their nature. Empires are parasitic. But cooperation between countries, where they trade on a friendly, equal basis, where they win together and lose together, right? That is a sustainable form of international relations. And Julius Caesar, he was a member of the Roman ruling class, but he understood that the system that Rome had in place was not sustainable. And while he wasn't a revolutionary or a socialist, he certainly realized that in order to push forward his vision, he needed to enter a strategic alliance with the proletariat. And Rome was the first place that we saw the existence of a proletarian class, those who sell their labor to survive, who are neither slaves nor masters. And even though the Roman Empire was deeply reactionary, it was the place that the greatest class in all of history, the working class, with nothing to lose but their chains and a whole wide world to win, Rome was the first place in history that we saw the proletariat come into existence. So I think that's all very, very interesting. And I guess I just want to end with, as I was listening to Justin talk, I thought about, there's a 1930s Hollywood movie, which is not really a great movie if you watch it. It's a lot of slapstick comedy, and it's not my favorite movie. It's called The Great Dictator with Charlie Chaplin. It's not that great of a movie, but the end of the movie includes Charlie Chaplin giving a beautiful, powerful, anti-fascist, anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist speech. And the speech that ends the movie The Great Dictator, it's been posted on the internet. People have called it the greatest speech in the world. And I think many people that hear the speech are just moved to tears by it. It's considered one of the greatest moments in cinematic history. But what a lot of people don't realize about Charlie Chaplin's speech about doing away with greed and doing away with national chauvinism and doing away with a system that puts profits before people, what a lot of people don't realize is that that was a very Marxist speech. That Charlie Chaplin, he had fundraisers at his Hollywood mansion for William Z. Foster. He distributed copies of Toward Soviet America to his friends. And while Charlie Chaplin may not have actually joined the Communist Party, he was considered to be a fellow traveler of the Communist Party. So much so that when the McCarthyite witch hunts in Hollywood started, he fled the United States. He ended up living in Ireland for most of his life. And if you listen to the optimism in Charlie Chaplin's speech at the end of the 1939 film, The Great Dictator, and its vision of a world without greed, without imperialism, its call saying, soldiers, don't give yourself to brutes, machine men with machine hearts. It's a very, very powerful moment. And if we can channel that kind of socialist optimism, if we can put out a socialism that's not fuck this shit, give me free stuff, but a socialism based on that kind of hope and optimism and scientific analysis, I think we'll be doing our job. And that's my vision for the Center for Political Innovation. I want to thank all the people who made this meeting very, very possible. I absolutely loved it. I hope that we do another very, very good meeting next month. And I look forward, I guess we're going to have a really good Q&A. So I guess Twink and Twink Rev folks, Gian and Sam will be leading that Q&A. So let's have a great Q&A.
Thank you, Caleb. Yeah, so just a few reminders and plugs. So cpi-usa.org is the place to get more information about the CPI. Or if you're not subscribed to this channel, this is Caleb Maupin's channel you're watching on YouTube, make sure you're subscribed, give it a like, notification bell, etc., etc. You know the drill to make sure that you get the jump on these events as they're scheduled. If you have questions, Caleb, just nod, is Super Chat active? It is. Great. So you can use the Super Chat feature if you'd like to bubble your question up to the surface, make sure it gets noticed, as well as supporting all of these activities financially. And if you have a question for anybody who spoke tonight, anybody who's here on your screen, then please just throw it in the chat there, and we'll pull them out as we see them, I guess. Caleb, I suppose you actually have the button, right, for noticing questions. So feel free to jump in if anything grabs your eye.
And if there's questions from our panelists or anything, feel free to do that as well. So yeah. Okay, I guess we're looking for any questions.
Well, I saw one in the chat earlier. Maybe I could just kick it off and throw it out to anybody. Relaying it. Sorry, I can't find it again. But living off the grid, in a grand socialist reality. Anybody want to do a little bit of prefiguration or talk about what challenges or opportunities that might present? Is that something that people could still do? Thanks to whoever asked that question, by the way. Sorry, I lost it in the chat there.
Do one of the speakers want to address that? If not, I can address that. It's interesting. I think the defining aspect of our time is that there's really nobody who can point to anything and say, I made this all by myself. And that's one of the aspects of our modern capitalist world. There might be some craftsman or artist who could say that. There might be a painter who says, I painted this picture all by myself. There might be a wood carver who said, well, I carved this, but that wood carver is going to use a tool that was made in a factory by hundreds of workers, right? That painter is going to be painting with a brush that was made in a factory and with paints that were assembled on an assembly line. And that when you talk about off the grid, right, you're going to be a hermit. You're going to live on the woods on your own, right? You're going to declare independence from the system. That's not very realistic in our time, right? And the contradiction of capitalism is that never before in human history have humans worked together collectively so effectively. However, the products that they produce and the wealth that they produce is not collectively accumulated. The wealth that we produce together is owned by those who own the means of production, and the working class only get wages. So that contradiction between there is no individualism really in our time. There is no non-alienated labor in our time, but yet at the same time, a small group of people gets rich at the expense of the others. And I think that's what we need to understand. The question is not how do we break and isolate ourselves further. The question is rather how do we cooperate in a way that is to the benefit of all mankind.
Thank you. I believe Lily has a question.
Okay, yeah. So this is kind of just expanding on the popular front against imperialism that you spoke about before. So I was just kind of wondering, can you talk about the whole point of a popular front is to include elements that aren't necessarily revolutionary elements. So how can we get these kind of like liberal, maybe socialist leaning elements to work with us to oppose imperialism and support multilateralism?
Dust can answer that since he's the one who raised that in his.
Yes. Yes, I came up with the term popular front against imperialism because of musicians like Woody Guthrie. Woody Guthrie used popular folk music to appeal to the masses of the people. Even my dad, who's somewhat reactionary, when I talk to him, he says, "Oh, I love Woody Guthrie," and he'll talk about the some of the themes in that. I'm like, and I'll be like, well, those are socialist concepts. He's like, no, it's not. And I've also been learning a lot from some of the comrades at Telehagwire, Chicano Nationalist Group, and they use popular themes within the Chicano culture, like cultural aspects. And they use that to promote anti-imperialist policies. And on my show, I've been studying country music and looking at positive aspects of country music and highlighting that. And you see comrades like the Cornbread Communists and a lot of other. And I think that really gets the heart of Center for Political Innovation. We're innovating ideas to apply to the masses of people, and a politics that is not linked with the imperialist Democratic Party or either imperialist party, but from and of the people. to oppose the enemy of imperialism. That's it.
Cool. Okay, so we have another question from Perseles. He's asked why doesn't Mao get credit for improving quality of more life than anyone else ever? Why does he not get credit for that? Anyone want to go?
Does Justin want to take that since he gave the talk on international stuff?
I'd be willing to take that. That's a pretty broad question. Why doesn't Mao get credit? Mao gets a lot of credit for a lot of things, but in the West, we seem to demonize and prosecute countries who had achieved a lot of great things. When we talk about China and we talk about other successes by socialist states, we consider socialist states, we don't really get to see the full picture when we engage in that conversation. And part of that is part of the propagandic aspect of it, right? People don't talk about the evils of Belgium and the Congo. They love to talk about, the Great Leap Forward and all the things that happened, despite the fact that a lot of those institutions and those aspects of economics and social political development didn't have a basis for even creating those situations, right? As opposed to colonialism and imperialism, which do have a basis for creating those situations. And so, it's a way of highlighting, trying to highlight or obscure really the successes and failures of capitalism while promoting aspects of anti-imperialist countries that people might see, oh, well, this is not right, or this is not, this was evil, right? People would say that. And the fact of the matter is that, these countries have achieved a lot, despite the fact that they didn't have a lot. And that's part of that perseverance, right, that I talked about in the presentation, part of building a new world, right? Part of creating something out of the old system. And that's something that has been really taken to heart, and especially by countries like China and the achievements of Mao and subsequent leaders of the People's Republic. When we look at what has been created and what has been done, we can see truly the manifestations of human power. And I think that's something that, people don't like to talk about in the West, mainly because of the implications it might imply, but also because it's a facet of development that if we highlight, it would get people questioning everything else that they've been told about these places. And a lot of it is lies, It's not to say there wasn't a famine in China. It's not to say there weren't problems with the Soviet Union. But the fact of the matter is that despite these problems, they were able to persevere and perceive and develop and create new systems of human inclusion, human quality of life. And that's something that we have to really discuss in terms of international relations and how we perceive these places, because we've been lied to. We've been lied to for decades, and the lies will continue so long as we allow them the opportunity to engage in that conversation on their terms.
Our next question is multilateralism socialist internationalism of the 21st century?
I guess I'll take that one as well. I would argue to a degree, yes, but it's also more than that, right? It's about engaging on a mutual level. It's almost like a universalist kind of principle when we talk about multilateralism, because it doesn't necessarily have to involve socialist countries, right? There are countries who are not specifically socialist states who would be involved in this process. Multilateralism is about creating a dynamic of mutual respect and cooperation among all nations, right? Socialist and non-socialist, because that's the benefit of the way forward. Ideally, we would want to see the end of imperialism, and this is going to create that dynamic for us through these systems of control, these systems of cooperation, through this dynamic of relationship. Because as we move forward as a society, as we move forward as a nation, we as America have to engage in this new system, whether we like it or not, right? And that's something that's really going to change the foray of international relations, but also it's going to change the dynamic of imperialism, right? I talked about the end of empire. We truly are living in that period, right? We may see the end of imperialism in our lifetime, depending on how old you are. But frankly, that's exciting. That's amazing to think about, right? When we engage in this conversation, that we could see a new world established from this. But more importantly, it's a world that creates the foundations for us to build socialism in a realistic and practical term, right? Building socialism in a world of empires can be quite difficult, right? And so in the early 19th 1900s, when you see the socialist revolutions, they're the intervention in Siberia, the Russian Civil War, various other conflicts of Western imperialist powers gaining together to fight the Reds, quote unquote. That's a whole aspect of human development that we saw take place, right? But in this new mode of global development, we now have the ability to build socialism organically because we are now creating the equilibrium, right? We are reaching the point of strategic parity between the world powers, between the world nations, and we can engage in a realistic conversation about unique, sovereign, and independent modes of economic development outside of the neoliberal regime on terms that don't require war, or that don't require violence, right? We can build these things organically. And that's a new concept. That's a new thing that we're open to. And I think that's really sets the stage for a new and hopeful future for us as a society and as a world.
There's a question here from the audience. Directed it at Dust, but anybody can feel free to weigh in. Can you discuss CPI stance, perhaps your own stance, on the First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, and civil liberties?
Yes. So civil liberties are amazing things. The right to go out and say your opinion, to have say over your government. But the thing is, the West does not have a monopoly on these. And quite frankly, there are places in the anti-imperialist world, in China, Bolivia, Venezuela, that in many ways are more democratic than the United States. The level of freedoms and democratic rights depends on the stability of that country. And when your country is achieving great things, is under constant attack from the United States, could fall at any moment because of these forces, you're going to have to clamp down and make sure your country does not fall into chaos. So maybe in revolutionary countries, some freedom of speech may be limited. But as we produce more productive forces, and here in the United States, where we already have so much, if we could get a hold of what we have and use it for the benefit of the people and build up the world, this would include freedom of speech. And we could also have neighborhood and workers' councils that have real say over the government, like the Communist Party in China does, like the colectivos in Venezuela. We could have that in the United States and have real say over a government of action to fight for working families.
Max, I think, did you want to add something there?
Yes, definitely. Socialism in every country where it's been applied has been different. It's had different levels of economic and material well-being. It's had different economic levels of security. It's had different cultural aspects in the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, etc. This will be no different with the USA. I am convinced that a socialist United States will definitely probably have a lot more existing civil liberties and civil freedoms than some other socialist states, mainly due to a couple of reasons. One, our geographic advantage, which gives us which basically shields ourselves internationally in a lot of ways from the world with the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The sheer power of the United States, if it became a socialist. To be frank, if the United States actually had a government of action that fought for working families and actually had a centrally planned economy along with decent living standards for people, we would be a powerhouse, perhaps even more constructively than we are now. But the thing is that we would be a powerhouse for good. And also there's the fact that as we are allowed more security and as there would be more stability within a socialist America, than say there may be in an underdeveloped region that's under attack, and as we wouldn't be as under attack as other socialist countries have historically, that would most likely allow us more civil liberties and freedoms.
Another question from the audience. Anessa asked, it seems we are doomed to a Democratic Republican gridlock. What is the way out? Whoever wants to take that.
Maybe Gavin wants to touch on it because we haven't heard from Gavin.
Well, there are a couple of things we could do. I mean, I'm pretty intimate with some of the state level policy initiatives that are trying to ultimately get a constitutional amendment to ban campaign contributions, corporate campaign contributions, and get publicly funded elections, which is be kind of a long-term solution to that. But in terms of gridlock, there's nothing we can do immediately, but there is certainly something we can do that would get some change in the ball rolling, and that is people just have to be willing to do the sort of thankless work of calling their representatives and hitting the streets as well when it comes to strikes and demonstrations. And so I would say that people need to be willing to do the not so glamorous work when it comes to this, and then also stop voting for the Democratic and Republican parties as well.
Yes, I think this is crucial. The Democrat-Republican divide is part of the infrastructure that keep the working class continually to support the imperialist system. Trump is ramping up hatred towards our Mexican immigrant brothers and sisters, Raza brothers and sisters, and the Democrats are ramping up hatred against China, against Russia, and they seem to focus on social issues, and they never actually get concessions for the working class. It's no secret that I supported the Green Party. I interviewed Angela Walker. Caleb Maupin interviewed Howie Hawkins. And I believe what they did was they showed the system for the fraud that it is. They were kicked off the ballots in Wisconsin. They were kicked off the ballots in Pennsylvania. And when you tell people this, they're like, this is a conspiracy. This is the United States. No, this is a controlled system designed at limiting people's democratic power. And I think it was courageous of all the independent and third-party candidates, Gloria La Riva, the Marxist-Leninist up in Vermont, people that had the courage to speak out against the "you must vote for one of the two evil imperialist terrorist organizations."
We have another question from the audience. This is Caleb. Feel free to answer this at any length, given I know it's a subject you've spoken about a lot, but it was asked. What's the best way to respond to people who inevitably bring up the communism killed a million people or millions of people trope?
Well, I argue that it's while we might disagree with some of the allegations that those folks make, it's not effective to try and debunk all those allegations, but rather simply point to all the people who have died as a result of capitalism. Capitalism began with the clearing of the commons, in which all kinds of peasants who had a guaranteed, life on a feudal tract of land for generation after generation suddenly were forced to become wage workers. The clearing of the commons in Britain under King Henry VIII involved mass executions of people for being homeless, of vagabonds. They were hung in mass. There was the clearing of the Scottish Highlands when they transformed the Scottish Highlands into capitalism, and they got rid of the feudal parts of the Scottish Highlands. There was a genocide and there was mass slaughter. You can talk about the fact that the basis of capitalism emerging, as Justin talked about, from mercantilism, was called colonialism. And that involved the genocide of the indigenous peoples of the United States, the genocide of the African people. Also, the transatlantic slave trade was very much a capitalist operation. And it was done to help corporations in the United States and in Britain make profits from cheap cotton and cheap products. And the trans-international slave trade involved the death of millions and millions of Africans on the Middle Passage. You can talk about the fact that as the British emerged to the imperialist stage of capitalism, almost every country they went into and forced at the point of a gun, a monopoly, had mass famines. Millions died in India many times. In multiple famine instances, millions of people in India died because the British Empire would not allow the people of India to develop their own productive forces and reduce them to being a captive market of the British Empire. Before China moved towards socialism, when China was still a captive market of the British after they seized it with their 2 opium wars, there were routine famines in which millions of people died. You can read about what the capitalists of Belgium did in the Congo, the mass genocide they they carried out in order to make rubber profits, right? You can talk about World War I, where 20 million workers were sent to their deaths just so the capitalists could carve up the colonized countries of the world among themselves. You know, there have been so many examples of capitalism killing millions and millions of people. I mean, there are annual deaths in the United States due to lack of access to health care. There are annual deaths in capitalist countries all throughout the world. During the 1980s, as recently as the 1980s, the United States began arming and giving weapons to drug dealers in Nicaragua to fight against the Sandinistas, and in Colombia to paramilitary groups that were involved in the drug trade to fight against the FARC. And what has been the result of that? If you look at Central America, if you look at South America, how many millions of people have died from the narco gangs and the rule of narco terrorists in South America as a result of the CIA arming and training those forces against communism? I mean, the death toll of just that instance, of just the narco terrorism backed by the United States, established and started by the United States to fight against socialism in Latin America, is in the millions. So anyone who wants to give you this big body count, and that's why communism is bad, they then have to account for the huge, massive, and constantly growing body count created by capitalism. But of course, the way that this is generally argued is they don't count that, right? Well, that's not real capitalism. Well, if that's not real capitalism, then I guess we don't have to be held accountable for any socialism. We can just say, oh, that's not real socialism. And that shows how this is a completely disingenuous argument. It's not really about how do we improve people's lives. It's about playing a word game where I can outsmart you with intellectual tricks, and it's not really a productive conversation. Real capitalism has existed. It's been a horror. Real socialism has existed. It's had problems, but it has resulted in Russia and China becoming superpowers. It's had some very, very good results in Cuba, in Venezuela, Bolivia, and elsewhere. So if you want to have an honest conversation with people, an honest, legitimate conversation with people, point to the body count of capitalism, admit some of the flaws of socialism, and it becomes clear that socialism is the better option despite whatever problems have existed.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any capitalist country that fully eliminated unemployment or illiteracy, and yet there are some socialist countries that have done that. So we focus on a positive as well.
All right, so we are coming towards the end of our Q&A session. We have a couple more questions already in the queue. If you maybe want to, slip one last question into the chat, we'll try and get to it. Nick B asks, how do we reinvent psychology/therapy in socialism? Presently, individualist pathologies are used to blame people for their problems rather than investigate how capitalism causes alienation. Does anybody have any opinions on this?
Well, I'm not going to answer the question directly because I'm not a therapist, and it wouldn't be. I mean, that's something that only somebody with a license could answer, right? That you would, that it's very clear that those of us who don't know anything about this couldn't be touching on this, right? None of us here are mental health professionals. One thing I will say, and this is kind of related, but it's not a direct answer to your question, is I think that one of the big problems facing our generation of millennials and Zoomers is over-socialization. And I think that we have been weakened in our ability to learn how to take a strong stance, learn how to endure the disapproval of others. I mean, let's be real. Why is it that we constantly see socialists doing everything they can to disavow Cuba, disavow Venezuela, disavow China? It's nothing but an expression of emotional weakness, right? Is that they don't have the courage to take an unpopular stand. Our media in the United States is constantly demonizing all the anti-imperialist countries. And a lot of young people who are interested in socialism have this terror of being associated with the bad guys on TV. But learning to be a revolutionary, learning to be a powerful, a person who can influence politics means taking an unpopular stand. It means going against the current, going against the grain, enduring the disapproval of society, right? Think of all the great socialist leaders who went to prison. Think of all the great socialist leaders who were killed, were martyred, right? And that I think it would be good. This certainly would not be any form of professional mental health or anything. I think it would be good for those of us who are looking to build socialism in the United States to develop workshops and exercises that could strengthen young people and get those of us who are involved in socialism to be more bold and more courageous and less afraid to take unpopular stands, to endure the disapproval of others. That we need to develop that skill of how do we How do we get people, the ability? I tell people one of the most beautiful photos that I've seen, it's not a beautiful photo, but it's a photo that illustrates the strength of the human spirit. Is there's a famous photo from Little Rock, Arkansas, where there's one African-American child, a teenage girl going to integrate her school. And there's a mob of racists around her screaming at her. But yet she just walks into the school with this bravery. That photograph kind of captures what it means to be a socialist in some instances. When the USA is getting ready to attack a country, sometimes you can really feel like you're swimming against the current, but you have to do it. And history often ends up pointing out that we're right. So I would like to see our movement develop ways to strengthen people's ability to overcome over-socialization and take bold stances. I would certainly like to see that.
Right, we are right almost up at time here. And so kind of wanted to throw out a final question to everybody who's currently on screen here with us. Clearly many challenges. The new political changes in the Biden and Harris administration could be a cause for concern. We know there are challenges around the world for all working people who want their dignity. What's giving you optimism, or what are you hopeful for? What gets you through the day, or what are you looking forward to? What are you paying attention to? And Gavin, if you want to start there, or go in any old order.
Well, I have just seen so many young people who are fed up with this constant, endless war machine that our taxpayer dollars are going to, and are fed up with the pervasive individualism of society that tries to atomize us so that we have no solidarity with each other whatsoever. And I have seen many, many youth that are starting to learn new things, that in other countries there are different ways of doing things. And even in the past, there have been some things in that direction as well. And so education and raising awareness, I have just been, it makes me, when I see you guys and I see many others as well, it just makes me proud to be a communist and to, really be on the right side of history. In the educational textbooks, they never tell you about Rosa Parks or Albert Einstein. They never tell you the true political leanings of any of these people that they want us to be our heroes, because the truth is that being a socialist and an anti-imperialist goes hand in hand with fighting for justice. And so when I think of people who have stood their ground no matter whose approval was waiting, I think of many socialists and communists and broadly people who fought for justice. That inspires me.
Nice. Dust, James, what's making you hopeful, or what's keeping you hopeful?
A lot of the folks right here, meeting new comrades from different perspectives, different ways of life, and people are waking up and seeing this. Shout out to Comrade Silas Mansfield, young kid, who reached out to me off the internet, lived from a farm, is declared Marxist-Leninist. The idea that that when 10 years or so, or whenever, when I was in high school, that was unheard of, to have someone in high school declare themselves a Marxist-Leninist and then go out and study that and look at that. And we need to be out there. Those of us who've been taught this from elders who were fighting in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, who have been in the movement, who understand the science, need to be out there and ready to educate and spread these ideas to bring about the change we want to see.
Right on. Lily, what about you?
So what keeps me optimistic in the face of so much adversity and pessimism is, I'll just quote Nelson Mandela: "Everything seems impossible until it happens." Throughout history, when all of Europe was under the yoke of the Nazis, people, average working people and peasants, took up guerrilla warfare against the Nazis. And I just have so much optimism because we are on the right side of history. We fought fascism. We fought apartheid. We fought colonialism, all these things. And now there's so much openness to these ideas like never before. You know, talk to people, say what we're saying in the 80s or the 70s to your average American. They'll tell you to go away and go get a job or something. But now people are open to it. People know there's problems in the capitalist system, and it's our job to convince them and build a better world. If you ever think that change, solidarity, and revolution isn't possible, keep this in mind. The CIA thinks it's possible.
It's true. That's what the standard of proof. We should apply to everything. Where are we, Max?
Great. Okay, what keeps me optimistic is just looking at our opponents. And I don't want to be arrogant or like underestimate them, but these capitalist criminals that currently rule our system, they're not going to last. They're fighting amongst themselves. They're fighting over petty political issues. They're not trying to stabilize the United States. They're not trying to build a better America. And it's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of class solidarity. But I mean, communists and socialists have done this before. Like Mao started, like the Communist Party of China was started in a women's dormitory in a laundry room. And it was like 20 people. Now it encompasses, now China represents 1/6 of like all human beings on Earth. And they're skyrocketing forward socialist development. Like we've faced harder times before, and these are trying times. These are the times that test men's souls. But honestly, we can do this. We can build a constructive socialist future in a socialist American homeland.
Nice. Justin, how about you?
So, as a researcher, we use empiricism to inform our decisions and ideas, right? So when we talk about being optimistic, I think that's the appropriate word for it, because it's the difference between hope and optimism, right? You talk about hope, you believe in something is going to happen, you don't have evidence to confirm that. But as an optimist, someone who's optimistic, you have evidence to support that idea. If you look at the facts, the reality, the material structure, we use science to inform these ideas. We use materialism to inform these ideas. And if you base your decision off of the reality, right, the material reality of the world, we are informed enough to know that the world is changing. And we are informed enough to know that things are going to change for the better. I am optimistic because I have evidence to prove that. I'm optimistic because that is the course of human history. And that is something that we are going to take part in. And we're going to move forward as we advance the cause of human liberty, human respect, and human democracy.
Thank you. Well, we'll turn it over to Caleb for the last word, but just want to say thank you from Sam and I from Twink Revolution for joining us. Caleb, take us away.
Well, I'll make some closing remarks, and then I think Max is going to end it with the Internationale, if I'm not mistaken. I think that'll be a great way to conclude it. But I wanted to just say, it's interesting because Charles Dickens was not a socialist. Charles Dickens was not a revolutionary. His writing very much, showed the evils of capitalism as it was emerging in Britain and the industrial society, and et cetera. But he was not a Marxist or a revolutionary. It was kind of a moralizing, almost conservative critique of capitalism. But what was interesting is that his novel, which is largely an attack on the French Revolution, A Tale of Two Cities, it opens with the line, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And I think that, oddly, for socialists and revolutionaries, there's a lot of truth in that, because these are bad times in the United States, right? These are very, very, very bad times in the United States. I mean, the conditions in the country with the pandemic, with mass unemployment, with the instability, with the capitalists fighting amongst each other. But never before, I would say never before in U.S. history has the potential for a socialist revolution and a transition towards socialism been so great, right? That as we're entering this crisis, it is very apparent that capitalism is the cause of the crisis. It's very apparent that a socialist society would resolve them, and that if we had a government of action that fought for working families, we could resolve it. But the thing is that, as much as Marxists were economic determinists, right? Everything will just kind of happen because of natural, occurrences. It does take people's will, right? Human beings have to find courage and strength within themselves in order to make it happen. If you don't have a moment in history where it's possible, you can't do it. But sometimes the conditions move in a direction where things could actually change, and that creates a moment where revolutionaries have to step up to the plate. And I actually thought that Karl Marx put it much better than I did. There's a very important pamphlet by Karl Marx called The 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, and he actually articulates what I just said here. And I'm just going to read just a paragraph addressing exactly what I just said here, and then we'll turn it over to Max. So this is from 18th Brumaire. Marx says, proletarian revolutions, like those of the 19th century, constantly criticize themselves, constantly interrupt themselves in their own course, return to the apparently accomplished in order to begin anew. They deride with cruel thoroughness the half measures, weaknesses, and paltrinesses of their first attempts. They seem to throw down their opponents only so the latter may draw new strength from the earth and rise before them again, more gigantic than ever, recoil constantly from the indefinite colossalness of their goals until a situation is created which makes all turning back impossible, and the conditions themselves call out, here's the rose, now dance. So on that note, I think Max can end us for us. Thanks.